Okay. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Lord, tonight as we again open your word, there is so much in this chapter that we should take notice and should take root in our hearts so we can understand the things that you understand and the way that you look upon man. I pray tonight you'll feed us with your word, open our hearts, open our minds, and we'll thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, last week, of course, we looked at Nebuchadnezzar, his declaration that he made explaining how because of his pride he was turned into basically an animal, or living like an animal, until he came to his senses and realized that God Almighty is the one who sets up kings and takes down kings, and he was just a puppet in the hands of God. And when he realized that, God restored him again to his throne, and he lived out his years in relative peace in Babylon. Now tonight we pick up, there's a gap here between the 4th and 5th chapters. There's some other kings that come to the throne between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and we'll talk about that. So there was nothing in there that was interesting as far as God was concerned with those other men. But there is something with Belshazzar, and there's some lessons to learn from this story. So let's start with chapter 5, verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass and of iron, of wood and of stone. All right, so here we have a picture of a great feast that Nebuchadnezzar hosted. Now, before we get into Nebuchadnezzar, we might just talk a little bit about who Nebuchadnezzar was. Now, he was a relative, or actually the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, as far as they can tell. There's a lot of conjecture as to how many kings actually reigned between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. And they have all kinds of, one of them had about, 10 or 12 kings, and he had it all figured out how many years each one of them reigned and so forth. But it's the best knowledge that we have. There was Nebuchadnezzar, who reigned for 43 years, until 605 BC. Then Aruradamus, or what is more commonly called Evil Murdoch. Evil Murdoch, that was his name. He reigned for 2 years, till 562 BC. Salazar, I wish they had English names, or Nerigliazar, reigned for 4 years, till 560 BC. And then Laborasared, 9 months, until 556 BC. And then Nabonid, which was Belshazzar, reigned for 17 years until 556 BC, and that's when Babylon was taken by the Medes and the Persians. So what we see is, or what we understand is, these kings had many names, and so it makes it very difficult to figure out who's who. They seem to take great pleasure in the more names that they could have, because it looked like they were really important. And a lot of these names were from various different languages that they incorporated into their titles. So it looked like they were really important. But that makes it difficult, because in one place he's called Belshazzar, in the next place he's called Nabonid. So, but it's the same person. So, and we see this even amongst the Hebrews. They had different names at times that they were called. So that makes it very difficult. But as far as we can tell, that was kind of the lineage of Nebuchadnezzar, of Belshazzar, not actually the lineage, the reign order. Now, not all of these were the sons of the king before them. Some of these kings were killed, and somebody else was put on the throne who was not of their lineage. So, but it looks like Belshazzar was in fact the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. All right. So we find out who he was. Now he had this feast, and this was probably a yearly feast that they gave in honor to the gods. It would not be unlike Christmas to them. You know, it really doesn't matter what's going on. We're going to celebrate Christmas. If we're in the middle of a war, we're going to celebrate Christmas, right? I mean, this is just something we do. Well, it's the same kind of a thing here. At a certain time every year, they would have this big feast, and it was to their gods. And it was a way of honoring their gods. And we know from history that at this time, the Medes and the Persians were right outside the gates of Babylon. I mean, they were out there ready to come in, storm the place. But because Babylon was so well fortified, and they had very, very little care about what was going on outside. They could last forever in there, I guess. They had everything they needed. The city could survive until they actually wore the enemy down, and then I imagine they figured on storming out the gates and taking care of the problem. But he had this feast. So that's kind of the background of what was going on. So he had this feast in honor of their gods. Now the ones that were present at this feast were the lords, in other words, the court people, the royalty, the important people, not only of Babylon, but also then of the surrounding cities and provinces where Nebuchadnezzar had his rulers set up. Now it says here 1,000, but 1,000, understand, is very much like an hour. An hour meant soon. 1,000 meant a bunch. How many? We don't know. It was a bunch. And so they just kind of threw it out there like we do. I'll be there in a sec. I'll be there in a second. And, we're not going to be there in a second. We're going to be there in a few minutes. But, So that's the way they used this term. But it just meant there was a huge gathering. A very huge gathering. Now notice something here that's interesting. At least I think it's interesting. He had a feast to the 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. What this means literally was that he drank in excess in public in front of everybody to encourage them to drink and have a good time. So this wasn't a situation where the king hosted this big feast, and then let them go have their big old time and he kind of sat back and watched. He was kind of at the forefront of this thing.
The ringleader.
Bring me another one, here we go. Yeah. So we get this picture of the king out there leading the charge to get themselves fully inebriated at this feast. Verse 2. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine. In other words, while he was drunk, while he was really in the, up to his ears, in the good old sauce, he commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem.
Which he probably never would have thought of doing if he'd been sober.
Not only would he have not thought about it, he would not have done it. And this is a point that's made in all the commentaries that I read. In those days, the pagans were very, very superstitious. We've already read that it wasn't a matter that you have your God and I have my God. My God's, your God's no good, my God's good. Everybody had their gods, and everybody's gods had some power. I worship my gods, you worship your gods. It's kind of like the universal church today. That's kind of the way it is. You have yours, I have mine. Everybody love each other. Yeah. But they recognized that every god had power. And so they would not think of desecrating anything that was consecrated to that god for fear that god would turn on them. So they were very, very superstitious. And I want to point something else that is kind of subtle here. And sometimes we wonder, why in the world would God allow Nebuchadnezzar to take the consecrated vessels out of the temple and take them to Babylon and put them in his temple, in the treasury in his temple? I think I have a pretty good, a very, very good, I think, answer to that. They were safe.
Okay, that's all right.
If they had stayed in Jerusalem, who would have protected them?
Yeah, nobody.
They'd have been melted down, they'd have been gone,
Yeah.
right? And so, this was a way, my opinion, this is Alanese here, this was the way that God chose to protect that consecrated vessels from the temple. And so they were locked away in the treasury of Nebuchadnezzar in the temple of his God. Nobody was going to go in there and bother anything. They were afraid. You know, that's like kind of like Indiana Jones and all these kind of movies. You know, you go out there and this ghost is going to come up and get you or something. You know, if you step on the wrong thing.
Yeah.
That's kind of the way they felt. You know, that was real to them. And so it was a safe place. But in his drunken stupor, now I think we also talked about how that Babylon was the Babylonian people were very good at building things, but they weren't very good at finishing things. And in those days, it was kind of the custom in that area around that part of the world that their drinking cups and stuff were like they were animal heads, you know, gold and silver, pewter, or whatever, but they were fashioned like animal heads or something else. I mean, they all had designs, and it wasn't like you had a whole set of things that were all identical. Everybody's was different. And they were all kind of crude, and, you know, and they would drink all these things. Kind of like you see in the movies, you know, or the knights, you know, they all have these real crude things they're drinking. That's kind of the way it was. And I imagine in the muzzled mind of Belshazzar, he thought, we have all of those beautiful golden cups that are all the same. And they're all fashioned, and they're all of the finest gold, and they're finished. We don't have that. Let's drink out of those. It's kind of like, let's get a new china set, you know, because they're all the same pieces. You know? So he went and got those. Brought them in, and there's a couple other little subtle things here also. He brought them in out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines. The wives and concubines weren't normally involved in these feasts. They weren't invited. These were this was man things, you know, man things. But sometimes when they really got plastered, then they would invite the women folks to come in, you know, because they needed a little more excitement. Enough said there. But they would bring them in. So this means that they were well into the feast at this time. This wasn't something that he did on the first day. These feasts last for days, you know, they were long celebrations. And so this was well into the feast, well into the program, when he decided to have all of his wives and concubines join him. And they drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold and silver, brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So they weren't just having a good time. They were actually using consecrated vessels in worship to the false deities of their day. And to me, I don't know, this is just a little side issue perhaps, but I think God gives us tools and gives us vessels to use in his worship. And he expects us to consecrate those vessels and use them for their intended purpose. But how often do people take their vessels and use them for other things that may in fact praise other gods? Whether that God is finance, you know, whatever it might be, whatever they have set up to be their God, that they expect to get riches and blessings back from. And they use their talents and their vessels that God expects to be consecrated to worship these others. Yeah, John?
Okay, the vessels were consecrated to the service of God.
Yes.
Okay, then they were taken to Babylon and put in the Babylonian treasury and dedicated to their God?
No, they were never dedicated. They were just stored there.
Okay,
It never says that anything happened to them other than they stored them.
Okay, so they were still dedicated to our God.
Yes,
They weren't changed.
they were not changed
Okay,
as far as we know.
I wanted to get that because C says they kept in Babylon treasures dedicated to their God, meaning the original God.
How do I have that? How do I have that written? It should be, yeah, to the original God.
Okay.
Oh no, the treasury that was dedicated to their God.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah, the treasury, not the things in the treasury.
Okay.
Okay, so that's just a little side thought. Now it's probable that the homage to these false gods was directed to the false divinities which were customarily borne on men's shoulders on festal occasions with much pomp and ceremony. There is a bas relief that they have in the Southwest Palace at Nimrod that they found, and they had a picture of it anyway, but the one god is sufficiently identified with the description of Belus or Baal, and the other one, seated figure, was the attributes of the Assyrian Venus, Astarte. So that was two of the gods that were probably present that they were worshiping. There is also some commentary from some of the people alive in those days, that historians that made comment of how they had went to Babylon and actually witnessed one of their processions, and they had their gods on their shoulders, and they were marching in these long columns with the priests and the wise men and everybody, you know, marching along with these gods made out of gold and silver up on their shoulders. And, it's kind of reminiscent of what we see today in Europe, especially in places like Spain, I guess, and some of those heavy Roman Catholic areas, when they have their processionals. It's the same thing. They put them on their shoulders, walk along. And the East also, where they have the Buddhas and some of the Eastern religions, they put those on their shoulders and they march along. So it was that same kind of an idea. It's doubtless that during this time they probably brought their gods in a procession through the feast hall. And here they come with their gods, and they would worship these gods and pay homage to them. It wasn't like they had them sitting on the wall. You know, they probably brought them through, and it was a processional kind of thing. Okay, verse 5. Things are about to change. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the parts of the hand that wrote. Now, a couple of things here. Here's the king. Think about the king. He's sitting there, and he looks over at the candlestick. Now, this candlestick is actually a lampstand. And it's not beyond reason to assume that if Nebuchadnezzar took all the vessels of the temple, he also took the lampstand, the table of showbread, you know, the valuable things. And no doubt Nebuchadnezzar had the lampstand brought out also, and probably the other furniture of the temple that Nebuchadnezzar took, because this was to show how, you know, powerful they were. Look at the booty we took from the Jews, you see. And so I can see this lampstand over against the wall, and I can see it lit, you know, and everybody can see, look what we have. And suddenly, by the lampstand. Now, we know from our study in Revelation that the lampstand was a symbol of the seven spirits of God. And what those, you know, I had my idea of the seven spirits, everybody else may have some other ideas. But I think in whole we can say that that lampstand represented both the holiness and also the righteousness of God. And I think we can say that very safely. And so here they bring the lampstand that stands for the righteousness and holiness of God in this festive worship to false gods, set it up, light it, and there it is against the wall, and suddenly, out of the wall, by the lampstand, came these fingers. Can you imagine how that must have, I mean, look, you know, am I seeing that? I know I've had a lot to drink tonight, but what is that? You see what I see?
That's exactly.
No, snakes, is there snakes on the walls? What's going on? There's something strange. But everybody saw the same thing, and that's what brought it home. These fingers coming out of the wall and began to write. Now, I didn't see a hand, he didn't see arm, he saw fingers that wrote. How they wrote, I don't know. I don't know if they burned into the plaster, I don't know if they carved the plaster, I don't know. Probably carved the plaster. That would be my assumption, based on the fact that the hand that appeared to Moses and wrote the 10 Commandments wrote them into the stone. So my assumption is it indented the plaster on the wall, and there were these words that appeared: by the lampstand, by the holiness and righteousness of God. In fact, I think we can almost say that it took the lampstand to present and to put a barrier of holiness and righteousness to the point that even the hand of God could enter into that evil place. So there may be something there. That's a thought. I don't know. Verse 6. Then the king's countenance was changed. Yeah, I imagine so. And his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. This is one of those comical parts of Scripture to me that I get a kick out, I almost laugh every time I think about it. But suddenly he sees the hand, the fingers of God, his countenance changed. He went from happy-go-lucky, drunken, happy drunk. All of a sudden his face turns pale. He gets a serious look on his face. His thoughts trouble him. You know, when your thoughts trouble him, your eyes get big and you're kind of, in other words, you're frightened.
Short of breath.
That was what it means. He was scared. He was frightened to the point that his loins, or the back of his back, which is what they're talking about here is the lower back area, which supports you and holds you up. It got loose. In other words, he couldn't stand up. And his knees began to pound together and shake. Now that's being very frightened, especially for a king. Verse 7. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now he was so frightened that he didn't just say, bring me the soothsayers and the, you know. We remember Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Well, he didn't get all that excited. You know, you can see Nebuchadnezzar in the morning saying, I want all of you guys in here. Now, here's what I want you to do. He was pretty rational, right? Not Belshazzar. He's yelling. That word that he cried aloud, that actually means he shouted with much volume. In other words, he's hollering, bring me the soothsayers! You know? So they march these guys in, and here they come. And he says to them, anybody that can interpret this dream, I'm going to clothe you in scarlet, which was a sign of royalty or priesthood, either one. So both the royalty and the priesthood wore scarlet in the pagan countries. I'm going to put a gold chain around your neck, which was signified that they were a ruler. This is something that you also see. You also see this in Egypt. When Joseph came into Pharaoh, remember? And Pharaoh said, well, if you can do me the interpretation, I'll put a gold chain around your neck. And that's what he did. He made him a ruler in the kingdom. So this was a normal thing to happen, a way of showing honor to somebody. Real honor, real honor. In other words, whoever this was really going to get some really great rewards here. And he's even going to be the third ruler in the kingdom.
Back when we talked about the other king brought in the Chaldeans and the astrologers,
Nebuchadnezzar.
that took a while,
Mhm.
because they weren't, all there. But because this feast was going on, more than likely they were in the area.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that they
yes.
could be there.
They were probably
Quick.
right there.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, they were part of this thing. They also, this third ruler in the kingdom is interesting. Some commentaries have said, well, that'd be raised to the third level of rulers. But I don't think so. Because in the Eastern religion, or Eastern countries in this time, the order of rulership went to the king, his son or prince or his named successor. The next one in line was, guess who?
Third ruler.
The third ruler, but you know who he was, generally? He was the chief magician and astrologer and whatever. And if you go look at Egypt doesn't tell us this exactly, but if you look at the story of Moses, the guy that was there all the time was who? The chief magician. So actually they held a place in Babylon probably of being the third ruler, which would be the normal succession. Like here in the United States, if something happens to the president and the vice presidents, the next guy in line is the wizard. Whatever.
I think
Speaker of
it's
the House.
the
is
Speaker of the
next one in line.
House.
Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
Yeah, in this case,
Oh,
could you
yeah.
really imagine that happening?
Yes,
No.
yeah, I think
Not
I'd buy a
that
ticket for
life
one way
law
somewhere.
was-
Yeah, I've
But
been,
anyway.
I've been living in Canada very quickly.
So what was really, I think, being said here is the magician, the wise man, the Chaldean, the soothsayer that can answer this is going to be the chief of all of you. Okay? Now, this, of course, opens up all of a sudden, and we say, where was Daniel? I thought he held that position. Right? Why wasn't Daniel there? Well, right away we can say, well, because it was a feast of pagan gods and he didn't come. Well, there's another even more, more plausible reason than that. And that is that when they changed kings, it was customary to get rid of all of the magicians, soothsayers, charlatans, all of them. They got rid of all of them. They didn't kill them, but they got rid of them. They were out of the court. And the reason was simple. Either they didn't have the power to tell the king what was going to happen, or they didn't have the power to stop it from happening. So the king died. So as soon as the king died, out they went and they brought a new batch in. So we knew they have probably at least 3 kings here that have come to power since Nebuchadnezzar. So it's probably, Daniel was probably retired, living someplace. Well, we know he was in Babylon, okay? So he was someplace, probably living in a retirement home type thing, because of his former position.
He still had high standing.
Still had high standing. Yeah, he was retired, but he was not in the court any longer. To the point that Belshazzar didn't know who he was. Okay? So, let's see what happens. Verse 8. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Now there's some interesting thought on the writing. It's easy to say, well, it was some heavenly writing. I couldn't understand it. Which it could be. I'm not at all putting that aside. In fact, I've always kind of felt that's maybe what it was more than anything. But there's also a very strong indication that this was actually written in the ancient Hebrew script. Now, in the actual Hebrew that was being used in those days was Aramaic, which was like a more modern written language. And so if it was the ancient Hebrew text that you would have seen from Moses, for instance, the wise men of Chaldea would probably not recognize it and not know what it was. It would not be a language they could understand. Not necessarily a supernatural, spiritual language, just one that was so ancient they did not recognize it, could not read it. This would kind of stand to reason in several respects, not the least of which is the setting as I laid it out to you. Here is the lampstand. Who was the lampstand given to but Moses? So here we have the ancient God of Israel, not Aramaic, not Babylon, God of Israel in his purest form. Would he not write in the purest form? The same as he wrote to Moses. Moses was there, Moses would have been able to read it. Interpret it, I don't know, but he would have been able to read the words. So they had a dual problem here. The king can't read the words, let alone know what the words mean. So, it's kind of like Nebuchadnezzar. Tell me what I dreamed and tell me what the dream meant. Here he tells his wise men, Belshazzar says, read it to me and then tell me what it means. Okay? So we have this dual thing again. But none of them could do it. Verse 9. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled. Now he was afraid before. Now if he was afraid to the point that his knees were knocking together, what in the world kind of shape was he in here? I mean, this old boy was ready for a nervous breakdown. He was really, really in a bad situation here. And his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonied or astonished. So there was such a change in Belshazzar. Everybody noticed it. And of course they were astonished at the writing too. I mean, I'm sure they were troubled also. What does this mean? They all probably understood there was something not good about this. It's kind of like that commercial that they had on TV a while ago, where the guys are up on the back of this truck hauler or car, and they're trying to get these trucks off down the highway, and the one truck goes off, and the guy's standing up left up on the car carrier, and he sees the thing sailing out over the canyon, and he says, "This can't be good."
Yeah.
I said, you don't know what's going to happen, but it can't be good.
No good.
Something wrong here. Yeah. Now, verse 10. Now, the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake. Now, stop right here for a minute.
She wasn't there.
The queen was not there.
Nope.
But all of Belshazzar's wives were there. So who was this queen? She had to be the queen mother. Either the wife of Nebuchadnezzar or the wife of evil Mordecai. Belshazzar's grandmother. Now she wasn't at the feast. They didn't bring her in to show her off. I mean, she's probably up in years. But she's in her apartment someplace, close enough to the situation that and I can imagine probably, her servants coming in there, "Oh, I got to tell you what's happening over there. This hand appeared in the king. He says, I've never seen the king like this. He's about to have a nervous breakdown." And I can see her throwing on her robes and headed for the hall. I'm sure she's one that didn't have to worry about anything happening if she walked in. This is grandma. You know how grandmas are. So she walks in. She came because of the words of the king. It troubled her to see the king, her grandson, in this situation. So she comes into the banquet hall. And the queen spake and said, "O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed." Now this is grandma. This is grandma words.
Take it easy.
It's all right, son. It's going to be okay. And this probably quieted Belshazzar to some degree. Here's grandma. Grandma's here. Everything's going to be okay. Verse 11. There is a man. Now, I think even right here, there's some real food for thought here. Even though Daniel had done all the mighty things that he did in terms of interpreting dreams and all the things that she was aware of, she said there is a man, not a god, not an image, not something else. There is a man in thy kingdom. And he hadn't run away, hadn't gone back to Jerusalem, he's still there, wasn't in the court, wasn't doing anything. For all these years, he's been sitting back there in retirement, not doing anything. I think this says something to us. Sometimes God calls us to do things, and we assume that we're supposed to keep doing that. I mean, if I was Daniel and I was brought into and I'm ruling and I'm doing all these great things, I would assume, well, this is what God wants me to do, and I'm set, I'm ready to do this forever. And all of a sudden, boom, we're out. I wonder what Daniel would do. I know what I would feel. I mean, I'd feel, okay, God, what's next? God, what's next? Hey, God, I'm waiting. God, what's next? Right? Okay, God, are you there? Hello? We would get to the point where finally we would wonder, God, is there any reason why I'm here? My ministry is not going anywhere. I'm not doing anything. And I think all of us have gone through that from one time or another. I went through it, leaving the pulpit ministry for a number of years. I didn't do anything. And I thought, what in the world? Why did I waste, 4 years of Bible school? I kind of went off and got an engineering degree or something, That's a waste of my efforts to sit here and do nothing. And go to a church and listen to somebody who doesn't know as much as I know talk about something he knows nothing about, which I did for a while. It gets kind of frustrating sometimes. You're sitting there saying, what do you say? That's not right. What's the matter with you? Can't you read? Why am I here? I can't go tell him that, so what am I here for? Yeah. And I think we go through that, but we need to understand that God uses us from time to time as He needs us, not as we think we should be used.
Amen.
So, and then also I think we need to be willing to be moved around a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the biggest problems in pastors, this is my observations, is a lot of pastors, they pastor for a while and they think, I'm a pastor forever. And so they stay on pastoring, and I've seen churches, that it was nosedived. I mean, they've done really well, and there's a time when it seems like it's right for the pastors to have somebody take his place. There just needs to be a time, and you can sense it. Well, they don't do it. And then the church goes down and down and down, and pretty soon you're sitting there with 20 people. And for the next 20 years, he's sitting there with 20 people saying, bless God, on these days God's going to bless, and we're going to have revival, and we're going to have revival. You won't have revival because you're not where God wants you. He may have called you to go be a missionary, to go teach, be in a Bible school, or to do something else other than pastor a church. For that period of time. And you may go back to pastoring at some point. I think we have to be flexible in what we do and how we serve God. Get off my soapbox. Okay, there is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Again, this pagan concept of the spirit of the gods. But he had that in him. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers.
The third leader.
Yes. Now, his father, and you understand, the father could be the grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, the same as thy sons could be the immediate sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, and so forth. So, notice in here, she ascribes the wisdom and understanding that Daniel was able to put out. She ascribed that to the gods. She didn't understand Jehovah. She didn't understand the one true God. But she knew there was a spiritual divine being that was giving Daniel the knowledge and the understanding. Yes?
It says here, in whom the spirit of the holy God is what was dwelling, and it doesn't say gods, it says gods in smaller letters later. But the Spirit of the Holy God is capitalized in this Bible. This is King
Yeah,
James.
I don't know what, in mine they're all small, and I didn't bother to look up the words.
Oh,
My
okay.
guess is it's probably Elohim, and Elohim can be plural or singular, and it can also be capitalized or singular, or small case, depending on whether you're talking about divine God, the God, or one of the lesser gods. They all use the word
Well,
Elohim, so.
she was saying Spirit of the Holy God there, and then she says that of your Father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, and the gods is not capitalized.
Yeah, yeah. It depends on who wrote, who did the interpretation on that particular Bible. Some of them are different. Okay, the point here is that she ascribed this to the wisdom of the gods, or God, not to the wisdom of Daniel. So she understood this was just not a real smart guy, that there was something special about him. And also, she mentions twice, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say thy father. In other words, listen to me, your grandfather, son, your grandfather made him the third ruler, or made him the chief of the magicians. Hello, are you listening to me, son? Okay, that's kind of what she was saying. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubt were found in the same Daniel whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called and he will show the interpretation. So she enumerates not only that he had a spirit of God that showed him these things, but look what else. He had an excellent spirit. And one of the commentaries said, well, that just meant he had an excellent spirit in interpreting dreams. No, I think it meant just what it says. He had an excellent spirit. When you look at Daniel and his integrity, his ethics, the way he was able to explain, the way he was able to present things, he had an excellent spirit. It was not me, Daniel, give me what I want. It was, keep your stuff, I'm giving you what God wants you to have. It wasn't Daniel in the forefront, it was God in the forefront and Daniel bringing up the rear, just kind of presenting what God wanted him to do. He had that kind of a spirit, and that makes an excellent spirit. And knowledge and understanding. So aside from the spirit that gave him knowledge and understanding, he had knowledge and understanding on his own. So he was a learned man. He knew the ways of the court. He was able to operate amongst intelligent people. He had understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, or things that, this actually means naughty, like knots. So there were things that were knots or naughty, hard to understand, hard to take apart, hard to get loose, hard to understand what that was. He was able to explain those so people could understand them. He was a teacher. He could take something difficult to understand and make it so everyone could understand it. And dissolving of doubts. When he said something, it left no doubt. He was able to take things that were difficult to get an interpretation or to know exactly which way to go, and he was to take away all doubt. This is exactly what it is. That was Daniel. Very much to the point. And he said, let Daniel be called in. He will show the interpretation. Not he may show the interpretation. He might show. You might ask him if he would. You bring him in, he will. There's a lot in that. To me, this speaks volumes about Daniel and about how we should be and how we should appear to the world. We should have that same kind of a reputation. You're sick, you want to get healed, call them. They'll pray for you, you'll be healed.
Amen.
You want to know what the Bible says, call him. He can explain it to you, you'll understand. You have a problem, call them. They have the answer. They'll give you the answer. No, they might give you the answer. They have the answer, they'll give you the answer. We need to have that kind of a reputation in the world.
Amen.
Daniel did. Verse 13. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? Now this tells me that number one, Belshazzar didn't know who he was. Never seen him before. So he was obviously not in the court. He was retired. He wasn't there. Okay? He knew about Daniel, but he had no idea who he was. Is that you, Daniel? Is that who this is, you know? Notice, also it's interesting, he calls him Daniel, not Belteshazzar, his Babylonian name. The reputation had gone before him. He was not praise be to Baal. It was Daniel, the Hebrew, Daniel. Verse 14. I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. Actually, what he's saying is that knowledge and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. I could go into quite a dissertation on the difference between knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, but I'm not going to do that. I saved that for my university classes. But anyway, suffice to say that knowledge shows that you have a lot of understanding in a lot of areas. That you're able to use information from all over and put it together and make pictures out of pieces. Okay, so he heard of him, found out if this was the same guy. Verse 15, and now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. They couldn't do it. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel says, whoopee. I'm in retirement. I'm sitting back over here having my rest. I've been in the court for 40 years, or 35 years, whatever, when Nebuchadnezzar put him in there, till Nebuchadnezzar died. And I had all of that time. 35 years is probably time to retire, right? We look at it and say, we're going to retire after 35 years. Don't tell them how old Daniel was at this time. May have been 60 years old, may have been less, who knows. So he was living his retirement, enjoying it. And here comes this drunken king saying, if you can show me this, I'm going to make you back in where you were. I'm going to make you go back to work. I'm sure to Daniel this may have been a real thing, really a thing. But anyway, it's just kind of a comical thing I think about with Daniel here. But he's offered everything that's offered to the other wise men. Verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet will I read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. What Daniel is saying here is, I'm not the least bit interested in the rewards that you're offering me. Keep them. I don't want them. I'm not giving you this as a way of getting some kind of reward from you. I'm not doing that. But yet I'm going to tell you what they are. This way, there's several things here we could read into this, but probably the one that kind of jumps out to me is King, you're not going to be able at some point to say, wow, or anybody's going to be able to say, Daniel was bought. The king bought Daniel to come in here and give the interpretation. He purchased him to come in here. He purchased his service. Because Daniel says, I don't want anything. I'm going to give you the interpretation because that's my job. That's my mission. That's my ministry. Enough on that. Verse 18. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Hey, Belshazzar, your grandfather, he didn't rise to power on himself. He didn't build this all by himself. God gave it to him, the most high God. Notice here, Daniel is speaking in terms that Belshazzar would understand. If he had said, Jehovah God gave this to Nebuchadnezzar, in the mind of Belshazzar, that would be the Hebrew God, just another God. But by saying the Most High God, this is that God that doesn't interfere with the everyday toils of man. This is that high God that's in the mind of Belshazzar that sends the lesser gods down to take care of the business and interact with man. He doesn't interact, the Most High God. But here is Daniel saying the Most High God gave the king the kingdom. Okay? So in Belshazzar's mind, this is the top God. This is the number one God in his mind. So he was couching his words so Nebuchadnezzar would understand. He gave him a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. He didn't just give him a kingdom, but he made him literally the head of gold. Verse 19. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew. Whoever Nebuchadnezzar wanted dead was dead. And whom he would be kept alive. So he would, if he said, I want that person spared, that person was spared. If he wanted that person to live in a lavish lifestyle and live forever in the ease of comfort, he did. Just at the word Nebuchadnezzar. And whom he would set up, and whom he would he set up. You can be king over that province. You can be ruler over that province, which meant you were, a province could be a very big, large area under Babylonia's rule. You king over a whole country under Babylon. And whom he would, he put down. Now this kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because that's exactly what Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that God did. He sets up who he wants and he takes down who he wants. He kills who he wants, he makes alive who he wants. So Nebuchadnezzar, God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to have some of that same kind of responsibility within his kingdom. That's what Daniel is saying here. Verse 20. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was disposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of man, and his heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. So he's reiterating to Belshazzar what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, this should not have been anything new to Belshazzar. He knew his grandfather. He knew perfectly well what had happened. That edict had been read over and over and over again, and I'm sure it had been read to Belshazzar. He knew what his grandfather had gone through. And yet here is Daniel reminding him again of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And notice what he says, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men. Doesn't hide up in the stratosphere somewhere and let some lesser gods do his work. He rules in the kingdom of men. Again, something Nebuchadnezzar would understand. And that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. Verse 22. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. In other words, you didn't learn. It's kind of like kids today. They don't learn. You tell them, no, you don't know what you're talking about. They have to seem like they have to learn the hard way over and over and over again. So here's Belshazzar, didn't learn. Verse 23, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand they breathe, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. In other words, you parade these images through here. They can't see, they can't hear, they can't know, they can't do anything. They're just a wooden, brass, gold, silver, whatever, hunk of something that you're carrying around here in these processions. You're showing all this honor to, and the very God that holds your breath in his hand is what he's saying here. The very God who determines every breath you take and determines every step that you take. Him you don't honor. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We have men today, and we have one now in the White House, I think, doesn't understand that every breath he takes is because God allows it.
Amen.
And when God decides he doesn't want to take any more breaths, he won't.
That's right.
And every step he takes, he thinks he has to have all of this counsel, and he's taking all of this, I'm going to make the best decision. He's not making any decisions.
No.
God's making the decisions. And every step he takes, God is the one who's directing every step he takes. And when God decides you're not taking any more, you won't be there. And yet he doesn't understand that. And yet he will give praise to everything else. Not just him, mankind in general. That they don't honor the one who holds their life in his hands. Verse 24. Then was the part of the hand sent unto him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Verse 26. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, Mene. Now, Mene, Mene means numbered. Numbered. Notice it's twice. Numbered, numbered. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. You know, when somebody is born, it's very hard to figure out how long that person's going to live. You know, you can't say to an average, oh, this person's going to live 70 years, this person's going to live 80 years. We don't know. Could live 10 years, could live 120 years. We don't know. But when you come close to the end, when the doctor walks in and says, you know, you have advanced stages of cancer, then it's easy to say, this person's probably got just a few more years, maybe a few months. We can number. We can put a number on how long we estimate this person's going to be around. Right? When you get up to 80 years old, you can kind of put a number on and say, wow, this person's probably going to be around another 10 years maybe. And with some assurity, just based on the actuarial tables. But it takes something that says you're about to come to an end before you can number it. So what mene mene means is that, hey, I've numbered your kingdom. In other words, you're about to come to the end. It's at the point now where I can tell you, you don't have long. I've numbered it. And I think it would be fair to say there was cancer in the kingdom. And I've finished it. In other words, your kingdom is over. Tekel. Tekel means weight. Thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. The old balances of justice. Job talks about it. I have some references in your notes. Job talks about being in the balances of God's justice. Pages turned here. 1 Samuel 2 and 3 talks about it. Job 6 and 2 and Job 31 and 6. A few of them. Basically what it means is you could, if you weigh something in these balances, you put something on one side, you weigh it with weights on the other side to see if it balances out. There's a story that's in one of the commentaries. One of the kings, it was in this part of the country, they used to take him into his tent in a private area, and they would weigh him every year. And that way his physicians could determine whether he was in good health or not. It was kind of a, they'd record it. And it was just one of the ways they kind of figured, well, our physician does it today. I mean, every time I walk in, if I have to go in and ask for a prescription, I have to take off my coat, get on the scale, because they want to find out if I'm still healthy, I guess. But in this particular case, along with weighing that, they would weigh him with the weights, but then they would also weigh him with coins. And his weight in coins was distributed to the poor. So that was his way of distributing to the poor. They would then weigh him with gold sovereigns. And this went into the treasury as something else, and I don't remember how all that worked. But anyway, it was his way of meting out, not only was he healthy, but also what was given to the poor, what was given to others. Well, this was a just weight, by the way, a just weight. So his weight determined what the poor got. Whether that makes sense or not, to them it did. Well, in the eyes of God, he was weighing Belshazzar against his justice. This is what he expected of Belshazzar. This is how Belshazzar weighed. And it went like this. Way light. He didn't carry the weight to balance the scales of justice. That's what's meant by Tekel. Upharsin, which is the plural of Paris, Paris being the singular. That's why you see both words in here. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Upharsin or Paris means divided or fragmented. There's even an illustration of it was found on one of the walls of one of the palaces of one of the kings in that area. I don't remember if it was Nimrod or not. It might have been Nimrod. They actually showed these scales. They were weighing them, and in the background they have this army, and they have these pieces of it looks like gold statuary and stuff. It's probably booty from their thing, and they're waiting to weigh it on the scales. So you can kind of see the idea here that goes with this is that it was destroyed, it was divided, just as that booty was divided amongst these soldiers. So the kingdom of Babylon was going to be divided or fragmented and given to the Medes and the Persians. I don't know. I don't know how Belshazzar looked at this point, but I think he had a certain resoluteness about him, because when something is not known, when it's a mystery, it can be far more frightening than when you understand what's going to happen. One of the things of terrorists, the idea of a terrorist is you never know what he's going to do next. If you knew for sure what he was going to do next, it wouldn't be near as frightening as not knowing what he's going to do next. Is he going to blow something up? Is he going to shoot us? Is he going to, let some toxin loose? What is he going to do? There's always that uncertainty, and that promotes more fear than if you really understand it. So I think understanding what was going to happen probably brought a certain amount of calmness to Belshazzar, even though he understood that probably his rule had come to an end. And also, he didn't probably read in here that he was going to be dead. He could have also assumed that this was part of his kingdom might be taken away or something. But in verse 29, then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, a lot of so-called scholars bring a lot of doubt on this chapter on the basis that it so much happened in one night. How in the world could possibly this happen in one night? Very simply, you have a feast going on. You have all of the magicians and soothsayers are right there. The queen is next door. Daniel obviously is in probably some retirement home that's set aside for, the ex-court people. So he's close. And in the court, they always had, raiment and gold. All that stuff was always there. The king, because you never know when he decided he didn't want somebody, he cut their head off, put somebody else in. So they always had this stuff ready. It was very plausible that all this could have happened in a single day or night, probably within a matter of a couple of hours. It's also quite probable then that while Daniel was standing there giving the interpretation, guess who? The Medes and Persians were already into the city at this time. Because Babylon was a big place. So it's quite possible they were already there.
I saw something on the television about that, the naked archaeologist, and he was saying that they found some places where those people could have dug in around the wall, where they could get right into the palace.
Well, we know how they did it.
Yeah.
We already know that.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll now read you some of that here in a minute.
Oh, yeah.
I think. But anyway, verse 30, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Darius, who was the king of the Medes, Median Persia, was 62 at this time, and he took the city. Now, understand, he didn't take the city. He was sitting back in his palace. Cyrus, who was his general, was the one that really took the city. And so these two are mixed throughout Scripture. One says it's Cyrus, one says it's Darius, but it's a little confusing if you don't understand. Darius was the king, Cyrus was the general. Not unlike Nebuchadnezzar when he took Judah. He wasn't really the king at that point. Nebuchadnezzar was his father. Nebuchadnezzar. They like this Canadian business. All right, I want to read something to you. This is kind of interesting. This is an account which is Xenophon, who was an ancient historian, writes this, and it's actually some soldiers involved, supposedly. But hell, let's just read it to you. The account which Xenophon gives of the taking of Babylon and the death of the king, though without mentioning his name, agrees so well with the statement here that it may be regarded as a strong confirmation of its correctness. After describing the preparation made to take the city by draining off the waters of the Euphrates, so as to leave the channel dry beneath the walls for the army of Cyrus, and after recording the charge which Cyrus gave to his generals, Gadatas and Gobryas, he adds, and indeed those who were with Gobryas said that would it not be wonderful if the gates of the palace should be found open, as the whole city that night seemed to be given up to rivalry. He then said that as they passed on, after entering the city, of those whom they encountered, part being smitten dead, part fled back, and part raised a clamor. But those who were with Gobryas also raised a clamor, as if they also joined in the revelry, and going as fast as they could, they came soon to the palace of the king. So here we have an account that the soldiers began making the same noises as the people in the city, having a big time. And so nobody figured out who they were. So they ran to the palace to the king. But those who were with Gobryas and Gadatas, being arrayed, in other words in their armor, found the gates of the palace closed. Now remember, we talked about the gates of the palace. I mean, these things were huge, fortified things. You weren't going to just go through those. No. Found the gates of the palace closed, but those who were appointed to go against the guard of the palace fell upon them when drinking before a great light. So here's the guard for the palace out there, drunk, in front of a bonfire probably, or some big light they had. They were just having a big old time. And they fell on them, of course, quickly engaged them in hostile combat. And probably killed them. You know, drunks are pretty easy to handle. Then a cry arose, and they who were within, having asked the cause of the tumult, the king commanded them to see what the affair was, and some of them, rushing out, opened the gates. As they who were with Gadatas saw the gates open, they rushed in, and pursuing those who attempted to return, and smiting them, they came to the king, and they found him standing with a drawn saber, and those who were with Gadatas and Gobryas overpowered him, and those who were with him were slain, one opposing and one fleeing, and one seeking his safety in the best way he could. And Cyrus sent certain of his horsemen away, and commanded that they should put to death those whom they found out of their dwellings, but that those who were in their houses and could speak the Syriac language should be suffered to remain, but that whosoever should be found without should be put to death. These things they did. But Gadatas and Gobryas came up, and first they rendered thanks to the gods because they had taken vengeance on the impious king. They then kissed the hands and feet of Cyrus, weeping with joy and rejoicing. When it was day, and they who had the watch over the towers learned that the city was taken and that the king was dead, they also surrendered the towers. So that's a historical. Who knows, if it's absolutely correct or not? But it sounds pretty plausible, and it would meet the criteria for what we see in Scripture. Mm-hmm. The one thing I found was interesting was the stance that Belshazzar had. I mentioned when you know what's going to happen, it changes your whole attitude. I think he understood. He was going to fight to the death, but he understood. And he met his fate at the hands of Cyrus. That's it for tonight. Do you have any questions, comments?